Bienvenue au dialogue du Collège Massey. Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Massey College is a place for ideas, and its mission is to nourish learning and serve the public good. Massey College, the place, is located on Indigenous territory for centuries, the cherished territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're so delighted and so grateful for the ability to continue to do our work. The idea behind Massey Dialogues is that to serve the public good, we need to have conversations that go around and build bridges. So we always try to have a conversation between disciplines, but also a conversation between generations. Today we'll have the conversation between generations with James Bird, who could not be on the screen, but will be sending his questions along the way. This is a very exciting day for Massey College and for the Massey Dialogues, because we are joined by Her Excellency the Right Honorable Julie Payette, Governor General of Canada. And I will have the privilege to have this conversation with her and with her long-term friend, Barbara Sherwood Lawler. Dr. Sherwood Lawler is a senior fellow at the Massey College. She's been at Massey Dialogues before, a fabulous scientist, and we're so delighted to have this conversation among the three of us. Let me introduce, although she needs no introduction, Her Excellency. So we know that Madame Payette was obviously an avid proponent of science and technology. She is an astronaut, an engineer, a scientific broadcaster. She was a corporate governor. She was on 2 missions in space and was the chief astronaut for the Canadian Space Agency. Elle est récipiendaire de 28 doctorats honorifiques. Elle parle 6 langues. Elle est membre de l'Ordre du Canada, évidemment, et chevalière de l'Ordre national du Québec. And it's not as well known, but when she was doing her master's at U of T, she was a junior fellow at Massey College. So we're so delighted to have her with us. Quel plaisir de vous accueillir ici, Your Excellency, and it's wonderful to have you here. So we've been talking a little bit about how COVID-19 forces us to rethink about the way in which we manage risk, the way in which we assess probabilities. And someone was telling me that there's no better person to ask than an astronaut about how to manage risk, how to reflect on how do you see this crisis from the perspective of having been up in space?
Well, first, let me say hello. Bonjour à tout le monde qui nous écoute. Quel privilège de pouvoir vous parler. Merci de l'invitation, Madame Desrosiers. And to be here with Dr. Sherwood Lawler, of course, is a complete honor, and with Mr. Bird, which I hope we're going to hear a lot from. Let me say that one story I've been saying a lot about astronauts in my past was the fact that I thought the human body and the human species was highly adaptable, because we launch on a rocket ship. We end up in an environment for which we did not evolve to function in, weightlessness, and we adapt. Within 24 hours, we're up there on a spaceship, on orbit of the Earth, traveling at 28,000 kilometers per hour, and yet we've adapted to this confinement, to this isolation from the planet, but living in close quarters with other people who are not part of our family, and we adapt very well, and we can do this for months on end. But there are cycles. We'll talk about that later. So now I can say the same about everyone and every Canadian on this planet who have accepted overnight to change a number of their habits, to go confined and to limit social interaction, often at the price, economical price very high, financial worries very high, bringing the kids home from school, and we've done it. So kudos to our and we do it. Why? We do it because it's important for others. When you look at the empty streets in Toronto or in Ottawa, you think, oh my God, this is the end of the world. This is terrible. Well, actually, no. The emptiness is telling us that we care about each other because we're confined so that other people can live. And it's a bit of an act of love. It's pretty impressive.
Yes, I think we're learning a lot about ourselves and also about the way in which we have to interact with each other. And I think you and I have been talking a little bit before about what will be the importance of science, certainly in managing this crisis, but also how science may help us reimagine some functions post-COVID-19. And there's lots of opportunities, I think, to rethink many of the ways that we're doing things, from medicine to social interactions to care for seniors. So any thoughts on what you see post-COVID?
Well, if I can address the current situation, clearly there are scientists all over the planet working frantically right now to find treatments first to some of the symptoms, the more severe symptoms, the symptoms that cause death due to the virus, and then eventually to have a cure, a vaccine. It takes time. But clearly, we need to go there in order to get completely out of this pandemic. Science is going to take us out. It just is not overnight. So right now in our arsenal, the only real weapon we have is the one of breaking the transmission chain, and that is why we're confined, and that is why we've limited basically stop our activities. I think, however, that some good, hopefully, will come out of it. And the way we do social interaction. Are we going to be not mindful of infectious disease that we can transmit to other people in the future? Should we shake hands anymore? Maybe not. Should we wear a mask when we have a cough? Yes. That could be a really positive outcome. We also see that our limited movement on the planet has actually changed how the planet's reacting. And for this, fortunately, Barbara is online and she can talk about that a lot better than me. But we're seeing changes on the seismic data of the planet. We're seeing areas less polluted because we're traveling less and we're staying put. However, I did ask the question to my friends that are on board the International Space Station right now. The new crew member that just arrived, the American Chris Cassidy, flew with me on my second flight in 2009, so I know him well. And I asked her, Chris, can you ask the astronauts that have been there for more than a month if they've seen a difference on planet Earth since we've been confined?
Yeah.
And of course, the planet is really big. So the answer was less contrails of airplanes, because we're traveling fast, but for the smog area or the forest fires, it's pretty much the same. But it's been only a month. Interesting.
Now let's bring in Dr. Sherwood Lawler then. It's going to be wonderful for me to be surrounded by two great scientists that are so that continue to be engaged with their scholarship and care about humanity and care about the future of humanity. So, Barbara, you were talking a little bit about the way in which risk is managed and the way we assess risk could benefit from an astronaut's perspective, or from, you talked about Apollo 13 earlier.
Yeah, it's been interesting. We're coming up on an anniversary related to the Apollo 13, which of course was the mission that was I think the third mission that was designed to land on the moon, but didn't make it. Most of the young folks will know it probably from the Tom Hanks movie. But what was interesting, there was an article, Julie, in the Guardian that talked about the fact that if we watch the movie, you see it primarily as if the entire response to the disaster was improvisation. But in fact, when they interviewed the scientists and engineers involved, there were some fascinating stories about really I think what we could learn perhaps from evaluation of risk, forward planning and strategic thinking around how we plan for and develop for emergencies. And I'm wondering if you have a personal perspective, given your background from that culture and that professional background.
Well, the fortunate thing is that I started as an astronaut in Houston in 1996, and one of the first guests that came to talk to our class was Gene Kranz.
Oh, wow.
Who was, and the flight director in the hierarchy of Mission Control Center is the top of the top. It's the one that makes the decision. And he was a hardcore flight director, been there a long time already, had gone through the Mercury program and Gemini program. And now we're having this huge problem. And we think that the astronauts are going to certain death. We have no idea. They have no idea how they're going to keep them alive until they can bring back the capsule, and if the capsule is going to make it down to the ground. So they're trying a number of things until they realize that they've exhausted that group of people. And one of the greatest leadership and selflessness decision that was made is to bring in a new team while the others rest and the others think. And that new team said, okay, we're going to put everything that we know, and we're gonna solve this with little bits and pieces, and because there's no miracle. And so it's people who came and worked together from all kinds of expertises and then found solutions at every level. The movie, as you said, Barb, emphasizes one part or two parts, and of course makes sometimes a little Hollywood.
It's license, the creative license.
But in general, though, it is this teamwork. We in order to assess risk, you can do this when it's all nice and quiet. You're going to assess risk, and you're going to have nice risk management matrix that you can use, and then all hell breaks loose. Then you're in the mitigation or the assessment and management of that risk. That's when you need to pull in input in order to focus. The leadership is important, but also the width of the expertise that you need to bring in. You need to bring in the expert, and you need to listen to them, and then implement that through the structure that you have.
So what do you think we can learn from looking back at those lessons of history? And then in the light, as we eventually come out of this tunnel of the immediate response to the pandemic, are there ways that we as a society, so not, we always emphasize at Massey, this isn't just about science and engineering, it's about that interface, that creative interface of science, engineering, society, community, and health and law. What do you think we may learn or begin to think about how we might need to do things differently?
Perhaps in the way we want to be prepared, because the preparedness is absolutely fundamental. In your lab, in my world as an astronaut, we are heavily prepared. But that doesn't mean that everything we thought out is going to happen or not happen. But it is, we think about it when we have time with all the various functions. And in the case of a pandemic, it's not only health. It's not only science, it's not only testing, it's not only medical, it's societal, it's economic, it's people business, it's family, and it's everything else in our society. So you need to bring in these folks in preparing your preparedness plan and have structures in place. We talk a lot about autonomy, the autonomy to produce mask or personal protection equipment, the autonomy for food. What happens if that's a volcano next that erupts somewhere and puts so much ash into the atmosphere that we can't have a normal crop season? Are we ready? Will we be able to turn? What should we turn? Who should do what? Who should decide how? What's the coordination? Part of it is necessary to think ahead, to heed the lessons, and then when you're in it, to look at other people as well and how they do it.
Well, it's interesting because this idea of teamwork is so important to basically how we function, but also learning how to work as a team and respect the different expertise, I think, is part of it. So James is coming in with this first question, and he says, I am so optimistic at our new world, and the fact that we have in most cases been forced to become much more almost conservative in all we do. Is that the way in which you would describe it? Maybe it's, I think what he wants is we're doing less, so therefore maybe we're doing it in a way that's more thoughtful.
Perhaps not taking things for granted the same way. We are definitely realizing that we can't take everything for granted. We took the liberty of movement for granted. We took the possibility, like, to just go and have a meal at a restaurant for granted, and now we can't. We can't go and hug our seniors the way we used to, and that is important. Perhaps that we are realizing how important that social interaction is, but at the same time, we have to be mindful that we are a petri dish walking. And we have all kinds of bacteria and infections on us. It's normal, but some of them we don't want to transmit to more vulnerable people or to little ones.
But it raises some interesting issues, and maybe James is, I think, getting at that. Oh, here, let's see what he says.
Interesting, I want things twice before we buy anything now, and that may be a good lesson for the future. That's for sure. Yeah,
and it certainly raises, I think, in addition to the good news story and the extraordinary coming together of essential care workers across this country, it also raises some light on the gaps, places where even in good times before the pandemics, clearly we had gaps in society. Julie, you mentioned, of course, where our elders' care is concerned, where the delivery of infrastructure and water, the participation of full community and particularly around water issues in the First Nations. And then indeed our kids and the educational system, the strains and the stresses that the teachers are under in terms of now trying to deliver to the students in a very, very restricted and challenging issue. So some of the gaps in our society, some of the places where even before the pandemic, our infrastructures were not as well in place, and perhaps funding not as much in place as it should have been. Which shines a light on our challenges as we move forward as well.
For sure. I mean, housing is another issue that, homelessness is not, if you're having to isolate or self-isolate and you're in a shelter, is just not happening. Yes, yeah. I'm sorry, Your Excellency.
Oh, I was going to say, yes, absolutely. Housing, having a plan to take that into consideration, and also the consideration of caring for end of life. I was speaking to a group of frontline health workers at a hospital in Montreal. And so, of course, I was asking them how they were doing, and they all had masks, and they were saying that there was it was a COVID-19 hospital. They said that the one thing that is really different from before, because they're health workers, is the fact that a lot of their patients are older and are at the end of life, and they are the only ones accompanying them. Mm-hmm. It was a very touching story.
Yes.
We're asking so much.
Yeah. We're asking so much, and maybe we need to, 5 weeks into this pandemic, think about relaxing some of this kind of thing because of the absolute importance that we have to be able to accompany and say goodbye. Mm-hmm. I know that one of my cousins who did not die of COVID-19, but she died of cancer, she was accompanied only by one person, but at least there was somebody from her life with her. It was very touching. I'm so grateful for the courage, the dedication, and the selflessness of our health workers.
Yeah, there are no easy answers, but it changes maybe our perception of what's possible, and maybe that's a hard set of questions for us to look at as a society, but maybe it's a necessary one.
It could be that also we will have to recognize that if we value this connection at the end of life, we have to equip the visitor with the same protective mask, and therefore we need way more, not just for healthcare workers, but for people that maybe provide an essential service, although it's a less obvious one. It's these small things that make us human beings. I love, Your Excellency, when you talk to young people and you say, well, I was in space and I saw the planet as a whole. There was no borders on this planet when I saw it from above there. And one of the questions that has come up several times in these dialogues over the last few weeks was the tension that exists between COVID being a demonstration of our interdependency and our connectedness. The virus that knows no border, it comes across, it affects people that have traveled all over the place, yet some of our reactions seem to be to close borders and to fold back to nationalistic instinct. It's going to be a difficult one. They will need moral leadership on this issue. Any thoughts from the former astronaut?
I'm not a sociologist, and I think we will need very much a reflection on this later when we come out of it, and we will come out of it. That is the only certainty we have. There will be an end to this at some point. Is what the reaction, the human reaction. We all saw at the beginning of the pandemic people buying necessities like toilet paper, for example. And now we know that people, when they feel afraid, it's a human trait we all share. We tend to want to go to something we feel solid. We go back into our family nucleus, or so it's. I would suspect. I'm an engineer, so I don't know all this, but. I would suspect it's a normal behavior, but that behavior also pushes maybe other people aside. I don't want the person to infect, or I don't want. The problem, though, is if the other person has a remedy, and you've closed the door, then you might not be able to share that. And so we have to reflect on how we share essentials amongst ourselves, and these pandemic, climate change, natural disasters, they do not know borders. They don't care what passport we carry. They affect us all, and they often affect those who are less fortunate in society. And I think as a developed country or modern society, we have to. It's an absolute must to think of others and not just of ourselves.
Dr. Sherwood Lawler, any comments on this? Scientists seem to be able to work together across borders. Is that threatened, or is that will continue? Or is that is it going to be important that we continue to do that?
I think, it's an interesting thing. Scientists like to say that. And if you look, I'm the daughter of two historians. So if we look through history, we can actually see periods in which scientists and engineers stepped up to that ideal, and other periods when they did not so much. They're people, and they have all the same flaws. But it does speak to something that I think that Her Excellency touched on very beautifully, which is this idea of aspiration. We tell our children, aspire to be a good person, because we know that we all have our moments of struggle. But if our aspirations are clear, then when we want to think about who we are, we have to find a way to try to live up to something that we maybe don't feel we necessarily hit every time. And so for society, too, I think that's an important message that, as you, I think, so eloquently put it, a lot of this is this melding of what we can do as professionals with our brains and what we can bring to this as Canadians committed to essentially an act of love for our country, where we say, well, Canadians aspire to be this. Well, in this moment, do I try to step up? Do I try to be more like what might be maybe more aspirational than real? But that's okay. That's what an aspiration can do for us. It tries to tell us to take that extra step. And it's really amazing to see that people have done it.
Now, I was thinking of something you were saying about Canadians and aspiration. I mean, there's a trait that we attribute to Canadians always is that we're very polite, right? And we let people go in front of us, and we are very good at queuing and waiting in line, supposedly. So the other day, I don't know about you, but this is something surreal, completely surreal about what has happened within a few weeks. I'm at the grocery store for my parents, and we're all waiting in line, distanced by 2-3 meters. And then at one point in time, of course, something happens that happens all the time in a grocery store. I forgot something. Yeah. But I'm already in line with my, and I've been waiting in line for several minutes because we have to wait to go to very few cashiers. And so I say to the person behind me, can you hold my room? And of course they will. And there's no pushing. It was just like perfectly normal. I ran got my thing, and then I arrived home to my parents, and I put the bag in front of the door, and I stepped back and I spoke to my mom across the window. And that is where it really hits home. The sacrifice we're making for the good of us all. It is strange, and we need to reflect on that. We need to pull out the good and the positive out of these stories, because that's, at least for me, it's how I see the end of the tunnel. There is light out there.
And it's wonderful to share these stories, I think, about what it has meant to participate in this collective effort. One of the people have said at Massey that one of the important aspect that we've learned is the role of science. Science has been really key in defining action by government. It's not always the case that governments listen to scientists, but here, by and large, they have. Is that going to, is that something that we should say that was a good thing? Science may come out as the winner. It has framed the action, and it should continue to frame the action. Does that change the way in which scientists will work, though, is my question. Is there something that you've learned as scientists from this crisis?
Barbara, do you want to go first, or I go first?
You go first, always.
Well, thank you. You're so good. Actually, the science policy advice part of it is something I'm a huge promoter. This is an idea that is certainly not new. The fact that you need to have folks that will provide advice to leaders, deciders, and people who will take in that advice and that input amongst everything else to make decisions, and to base their decision on facts and reliable information is very important, clearly. So to have a infrastructure of science advice, sound, reliable, independent, and careful, meticulous, is absolutely necessary to society. This is something that we have, and we need to continue to foster and to build.
Yeah, it's a palpable change for sure. I find myself having conversations about being asked, what does a doubling rate mean? What does a slope mean? Just neighbors. These are not conversations I enforced upon my neighbors under regular circumstances. So it's an interesting one to have. And these are not science per se. These are fact-based ways of interacting with our world. Those two parameters that I threw out there are as much history and demographics and finance as they are science. But it is a reflection, I think, of a moment in time when a broader swath of society are recognizing, once again, matter, because they come back to the things that Her Excellency referred to at the very beginning of her remarks, that how we go about in the future thinking about risk, strategic planning for societal response to global challenges. I think perhaps we have a moment to embrace that, to learn from that, and to figure out then how we might take the terrible time, and there's been so much suffering, wonderful responses, but a lot of human suffering. How do we take that moment and then think, okay, as we now go forward to other global challenges like climate change, like poverty, like equity, how can we apply what we have learned? Human beings are, as you mentioned, adaptable. We can learn.
We can.
And it'll be interesting to see from sociologists and psychologists and historians, and those who study the response of human beings to this time, what we learn from a moment like this.
Hopefully we will. Sometimes we forget what we've learned and we continue. Let me address risk again, Natalie, for a very brief moment, but risk exists everywhere. There's a risk to take your car. There's a risk to cross the street. There's a risk, and of course, probability help us to assess the risk. But when it comes to preparedness, you can plan for risks, and the more people you've got around the table, then the more risk you probably will consider. Then you have to manage it when it happens. And if it happens and it doesn't go exactly the way you want, you need to mitigate that risk, and that's when you're going to change your plan, because the plan you've thought out before. Well, this is something that should, I think, be taught in terms of normal, because we all have to face decisions like that in our normal life. I mean, my son laughs at me because I have this idea that every time I would go into, say, a cinema or a concert hall, I'm always telling him where the exit is. Did you see that the exit is right there? And he's like, okay, Mom, whatever. And it's because I've been trained all my life to know where the exit is or how to get out. It's kind of this kind of thing should be part perhaps of a curriculum, that and critical thinking.
Yes.
Because right now we're getting so much information. Yeah, the COVID-19 came from a bat, or it came from this or another conspiracy theory. And then, of course, there are predators out there that will take advantage of people and this situation to get some gain. The first line of defense against misinformation is us and our capability to say yes or no.
Yeah, and the ability to critically. I'm glad we have some questions from the audience here. So, Catherine Fowler, as discussed, there are so many gaps that it is sometimes overwhelming to consider. How do we know where to start? Do we have the institutions to support this work in terms of how we move forward? Particularly, if we think about the lessons learned, is one of the lessons the ability or the lack of ability of connecting the dots will be one question. Barbara, let's start with you. Any thoughts, any good advice about how we use this crisis to think more about how to create a good information system that feed themselves?
Well, this will be a generality, but I think nonetheless a principle that could guide where we go. And one is that, again, interdisciplinarity. So two things that Massey does beautifully. Interdisciplinarity, that we learn best from each other, that no one group has all the answers, and by exchanging ideas we'll get somewhere. And then two, the intergenerational. All the ideas are not going to come from one set of experts somewhere. I think this is, again, something that Massey does so well, understanding that the communication from one generation to another, to the elders, all of our communities benefit when you have everyone bringing that to bear. So whatever we do have institutionally coming forward, I think we'll have to put the pieces together from existing. There are existing institutions and disciplines who do this kind of thing, but it will be stronger if we invent a process that has that interdisciplinarity and intergenerational exchange embedded.
And thank you. And not to be afraid to shift priorities. See, there are things that certainly in the gaps that have been identified in the past few weeks, things that weren't people didn't expect, or perhaps did not put enough
emphasis
on it, and then whoops, it sprung. Well, the ability to shift then your actions and your reaction is absolutely key. To ponder the pros and cons, and that too, there are all kinds of ways to do that, tools, sometimes even writing a side of pros and a side of cons, so to help the final decision and where we're going and what kind of input and help we need. It is this kind of agility that is fundamental in times of crisis.
Well, this is good advice, because we know that pretty much all institutions, all players had to reinvent themselves very quickly, use technology when they didn't used to, and so on. So I have another questions from the audience here. Is Ricardo DiCipio. Is there a protocol in case the virus affected astronauts on the ISS?
Well, thank you for the question. We actually are very familiar with quarantines. So we go on quarantine way before the flight. And the reason is that we don't want to bring any infectious disease up there. So usually it's the common cold that we're worried about. So we can't see our families several weeks before. And in the case of the space shuttle, it was 7 days. But before that, there were limited social interaction with other people, and only people who have no symptoms could come by. There was a lot of quarantine. We were in quarantine. So astronauts are in quarantine. They are definitely not infectious by the time they launch, and they speak to their family across windows. So this kind of thing. Now, another thing that astronauts are quite familiar with is living in isolation and far away from loved ones. And the tips that I got from my colleagues are quite interesting. The one tip that comes back a lot is what I alluded to earlier about cycle. The first few weeks, say you're going into a spaceship for 6 months. The first few weeks, you've just arrived. You've been in quarantine. You launch on this rocket and you got to space. You see the Earth from above. It's absolutely magnificent. And you're getting the routine, getting used to this new environment. You're floating in the cabin in weightlessness, and it's actually a ton of fun. And then 4 or 5 weeks later comes phase number 2 in the cycle, which is you just realize you're in there for several months. You can't go and take a walk. You can't hug your kids or your wife or your husband. You can't. You have to deal with these other crew members all the time, day in, day out. You can't avoid them. And it's going to be long, and it's isolated. So there's a bit of a downtime. And most colleagues say that the way to address this is first to recognize it when we're not feeling as good about the situation. And find something that will please you. Take care of yourself. Yeah. Because you can't be a good crew member if you are not well. And if you see another crew member that might seem to have difficulties, well, reach out. And hand. Well, these tips are true right now more than ever. Yeah. You look around you, do some good. But if you're not well, you need to take care of yourself. Very important to do something you like. There's all kinds of things, and everybody's different.
What did you do? What did you do to look after yourself? To the things that made you feel good?
I was not on 6-month mission. I was on 2 weeks mission, which were a construction mission, and they were so full of adrenaline that you basically launched and came back 2 weeks later and woke up from space, because it was just go, go, go. But what I did find, though, is the absolute complete lack of privacy, which some people probably, some of them might feel. I mean, either some people are completely isolated, living alone, and it's really important to reach them through electronics. Oh, by the way, thank Lord for electronics, because I don't know what they did 100 years ago without iPads and YouTube. But so there's the people isolated, and then there are the people who are several of them in a small space. Well, it's been 5 weeks now. Yet we can take walks, but still we're on top of each other, and tension human too. Fortunately, thank Lord, we're heading towards summer, and not toward winter. And the brighter days out there might help our situation.
Speaking about reaching, did we lose James there?
Mm-hmm. I have questions here from Anupamana. The need for global cooperation has been emphasized. How would Canada push for that in global organization? They often suffer from unnecessary bureaucracy, delaying critical response times. We know that this is a big issue in this crisis and this assessment. Any thoughts on, you both work for international organizations in a way. So what did you learn about working in this in terms of ensuring that they function well?
Well, again, it's not in a time of crisis that we're going to solve gaps or collaboration or cooperation inefficiencies, but we must, again, at the end of it, in these sectors in particular, review how we do things and ask ourselves strongly how we can do this better. How can we be more efficient? Where it went well? Lessons learned. It's a term that in my world is very common. I know in Barb's as well. Lessons learned are really important because not everything went bad, but not everything went well either. And at the end, when you have the time to reflect, take those lessons learned and take the good things and address those that could be done better. To do that, you have to do it in collaboration. In silo might work, but it's a lot better to have when we can reconvene. But now I think teleconferencing will become a much more ordinary things. It's the new norm.
Yeah. So Barbara, you also have experience in trying to manage good governance on institutions. Any tips here? And then I'll get back to James' question. Yes.
Oh, good. I'll jump in just quickly. Yeah, it's the advanced planning issue as well. We need to, I think, when we take a look at how international organizations function, distinguish between what happened because of politics and the functionality, which comes down to professionals, often civil servants, who have been there and are in place and will be in place long after the political side of it. So structures is what I'm trying to say. The structures are what will allow international organizations to carry on regardless of what happens in the political waves. And I know for sure in my own discipline came out of the organizational structure of isotope geochemistry, came out of lessons learned in the Second World War. Yeah. And it remains, and it's very strong. And it because it has strong structures and advanced planning will never be able to predict everything, but will provide you with a set of tools, a raft, as it were, that won't completely save you, but it'll allow you to maybe manage the rough seas.
So we need a raft, and I think I have some good questions here from James Bird. Isolation presents its own challenges in architecture because James is an architecture. He's an artist, is an architect. In architecture, there have been interesting discussions about new ways in which we activate space. Space has now become sacred in many ways, and this is quite interesting to reflect on how we will build houses if we have to think about self-isolation in the future. It's fascinating. Thank you, James, for these questions.
James he's so right. It could be an astronaut because one of the things that we found it's been more than almost 60 years now since the first flight of a human being in space, Gagarin, in 1961. So, and there's been a lot of experience. And what we found over the years is that for long duration mission, it is absolutely essential that people have their own space that nobody can violate. But because the spaceship is really small and there's not much room, they give them the equivalent of half a telephone booth, vertical. So it's really that's your space. You can close the door, and in there, that's where you sleep. That's where your sleeping bag is. It's vertical. I'm sorry, but in weightlessness, it doesn't matter which direction you sleep. You can put out pictures or not. That's your space. And I think that in the way James is saying it, is saying that maybe we should have that. Well, we think we have it, n'est-ce pas, Barb, with teenagers and having their room, and this is totally sacred, and maybe a chemical experiment.
But I think James has touched on something beautiful too, because the interaction between design and architecture comes into play as well. I'm sorry, I forgot the name, but I heard a lecture from a colleague at Carleton University, and he talked about how one of the challenges in climate is when we look at heating, how much greenhouse gas emissions is related to our heating, we recognize that the increase in square footage and ceiling height per person has gone up enormously over the last generation. We expect, or at least on average, society seems to have built into their building norms this large volume of space that we don't actually use, is 20 feet high. And yet we have to heat. And it was a fascinating discussion of this interface between architecture, design, and the implications for reducing our climate footprint. And I do massively apologize. I wish I could remember off the top of my head the name of the colleague at Carleton who gave that lecture. But it really speaks to, I think, some of the things that James brings forward from his discipline as well around these issues of what management.
I'd have a question for James, because another thing we learned through space flight is that the fact that you can see the Earth and it's a magnificent view actually makes you feel very, like people ask, do you feel claustrophobic in a spaceship, in a tin can in space? And the answer is no, not at all. Because you look out and you have the world at your feet. It's extraordinary. So the role of windows and a view to the outside. There are many building norms in places where every worker has to be able to see natural light. I wonder what James would have to say about this. I think it is also part of the kind of thing we need to think about next.
Yes, I think I can't wait to have him. I think we're going to have a Massey dialogues about the role, the change in design, and the way in which architecture frames our responses. But before that, I have questions from Shane Sanderson. Though not ubiquitous nor perfect, the current situation has encouraged lots of individual and institutional compassion. How do we maintain this social care after the pandemic is over? We've talked about compassion, Your Excellency.
Yes, we actually in our with my team at the Office of the Governor General, we tried a lot to see. I have a constitutional responsibility as Governor General, but then what else do we do since we've stopped our public activities? And one of the activities we've started is to we call it Caring Nation, or Nation Compassion in French, where we need to hear the stories and we need to preserve them, because at the end, perhaps we can integrate that. And again, how to do this is certainly complicated, but integrate that in our new way of being with one another. That and I must say, with the events in Nova Scotia over the weekend, tragic events, our heart goes out to every Nova Scotian and families of the victim. But it is something that we must do again. But how do we integrate that? How do we remain? Yes, we're more compassionate and we're more in tune. Yeah. I speak to more people. I speak to my own kid more than I would have if it hadn't been the pandemic, because he wouldn't have been at home and I wouldn't have been at home. So how do we preserve that positive? This should be a challenge to the listeners, to give ways to implement this? Because otherwise there are words, but they should turn into concrete action.
The Caring Nation website on the Rideau Hall website that Her Excellency is speaking about, I think is a beautiful thing. If you haven't seen it yet, it's an opportunity for anyone to go on and tell a story, to give some thanks. There are hard stories there, but many of them are really inspirational stories. You know, John Krasinski is doing a whole show on some good news, but I'm pointing out that your website got there before he did. So take a look at the website, because I think it speaks to that issue of leadership. Yeah. We make caring and compassionate an explicit aspirational goal. Yeah, you know, we're not going to get there every time, just as Canadians are not quite as nice as we all pretend to be, and we don't say we're sorry quite as much as we pretend we do. But if that's what we put out there, if that is our knee-jerk, almost a little bit cartoonish idea on a global scale of what Canadians are, well, you know, that puts a little pressure on us. Maybe step it up.
So James is responding to the idea of how windows are important. People and that's what he says, people in basement apartments have been suffering terribly from lack of sunlight. Windows have now become and redefined as such an important factor. Light as a new appreciation. It's true about sunlight, but I know that and now I'm speaking for myself, at Ron Daniels' Faculty of Architecture, where James took me, they were looking at the ways in which to bring in even artificial light. Window and design of bringing in sunlight have moved to the top of priorities in design now. So I think we know psychologically how important it is to have light and feel empowered by light. I know that one just last point that I wanted to bring before we bring this to a close is the connection between climate change and this current crisis, COVID-19. There's some, it's been discussed at Massey Dialogues. There may be some connections. We don't know. It's too early to tell. But certainly we know that the way we manage this crisis will help us think about how we manage the next crisis. And the next crisis could be a pandemic, but it could also be raging fires. It could be the way in which our climate is changing and creates some difficulties for the way in which we've constructed ourselves and constructed our society. So, Barbara, maybe I'll start with you and end with Her Excellencies for her final words. Anything that you think we should learn from COVID to climate change? Any things in terms of the management that you would want to see going forward?
Well, I think it's the same. I mean, we recognize that when crisis hit, it's the most vulnerable. It's where we had gaps already that become the hot points. Mm-hmm. And but perhaps most importantly, this allows us to imagine what's possible differently. Around climate change, there's a lot of passivity, this idea that, well, we can't do that. Well, it would be too expensive. We really can't come to grips with this. I think what we've seen here is it is possible to react. It's possible to do what needs to be done. And potentially we can do it much more effectively, with much less cost to the overall economy if we think about what the possibilities are clearly, keenly, and with rigor beforehand. So I hope it opens up our sense of what is possible in response.
Thank you, Your Excellencies.
Well, I think it demonstrates a number of things. This pandemic is already taught us and tells us every day that collective action works. Mm-hmm. We are right now all doing our part, all staying put and following the directives, and it works. It means that there is no massive, overwhelming number of people in the hospital. People are not, even though there are still huge suffering. Mm-hmm. When we put our minds to it and do it together, it does make a difference, and we see that in the climate. already through the pandemic as a secondary aspect, we know that the planet is actually a little less polluted because we travel less, which means that if we do this collectively, it will have an effect. Is it exactly the effect we want? That's another question. But at least it's proving to everyone that collective action, deliberate collective action, works. The last part of it, and I must say to me, it's I remain optimistic. I believe in science. I trust science will come up with factors. In the meantime, though, we are all part of the fight against the virus. We all have a part to play. Our essential workers and our frontline health professionals are there. They're extraordinary, but every single one of us has a part to play in this. And at the end, we will be able to say that this was a collective victory, that we all did something to make this happen. And when it's time to restart and to rebuild, especially to restart small businesses, then hopefully that compassion we talked about and mentioned so many times in a dialogue which was supposed to be about science, compassion needs to be there when we restart again.
Well, I want to thank you both from being here, and I just want to share the final thoughts from James, where he says our greatest challenges present our greatest opportunities, and he's so right here. I think I want to merci beaucoup. Je veux vous remercier beaucoup d'avoir participé au dialogue du Collège Massey. Thank you so much, both of you, for being part of it. And thank you, James, to have managed, despite the technical difficulties, to connect and share your thoughts. We will continue the Massey dialogue because I think it's important for all institutions to step up to the plate and try to do their contribution in a new way. Great words about compassion, great words about science wanting compassion as well. It's interesting to have two scientists speaking about compassion. How important it is. Merci beaucoup, and see you tomorrow.